Welcome to the premiere episode of Maine's Amateur Wrestling Podcast. I'm Thorn, Dickinson, and I'm incredibly excited today to have with me my co-host, Dennis Bishop, who has just been the newest inductee to the New England Wrestling High School Hall of Fame. Dennis, maybe just tell me a little bit about that experience and what it felt like for you.
Came as a complete surprise when the NPA called me to tell me about it. I'm sure Mike Bisson thought that there's no one on the other end because I couldn't speak for about 30 seconds. It's the pinnacle of my career. I never saw it coming, so very honored.
Yeah. Well, there's a great Facebook page for Maine Wrestling, and they posted the video and a great shot of you having your arm raised on that. And there were more comments on that from, I could tell from the long history of Maine wrestling and people that care about you and care about what you've done for the sport. It was really nice to see. If you had to summarize it, I mean, this is the newest chapter in a long history you've had in Maine wrestling. But if you had to summarize for someone in a short bit your career in wrestling, from where it started to where you are now, how would you do that?
As an 82-pound freshman at Biddeford back in 1963, not a fiber of muscle or a shred of confidence. If you'd have told me that I would have ended up in the center of that mat this past Saturday being inducted, I would have thought you were crazy. But what I did learn from that experience in the next few years was a profound love for wrestling, even though my career itself was short and undistinguished. It was still, I just loved the sport, and I knew I'd always be involved one way or another.
Well, I think that's the one thing about wrestling is that every individual wrestler learns something, even if maybe they don't get the accolades of being a four-time state champ or things like that. I think there's a mental toughness that comes with that you learned. Yeah. And like you said, I think I was probably similar. I think when I was in 8th grade, maybe I might have been a little heavier than you, but I remember my freshman year in wrestling on the varsity, 105 pounds. So
there you go.
That feeling of getting on the mat when the other kid looks bigger than you and the other kids on your team are counting on you for scoring points could be a pretty intimidating thing.
It sure can be. I mean, at 82 pounds, everybody looked bigger than me, even the girls. But I did overcome that as I went through high school. And like I say, what I got was a profound love and respect for the sport. And I was involved after that ever since.
Yeah. And I know just from the highlights of, I also read your induction into the Maine Hall of Fame. And also listened to the audio from the New Englands. You did a lot of coaching for a period of time after that.
Yeah, I got involved. A former teammate of mine from Biddeford, Jim Aguilar, had come back. They had dropped the program after my senior year. He had gone on to college, BU, and when he got done, he came back to Biddeford, and he restarted the program. And he talked me into assisting him. And that was the beginning of it for me right there. And so 1971 was my first year. And I made every mistake in the book and probably invented a few new ones. But it was an experience, and I learned. And I went from Biddeford to Kennebunk. And then when I got employed by BIW and moved up that way, I started coaching at the Hyde School with Gary Kent, then to Mount Ararat, and then a year at Morris, and then I worked their middle school program for a few years. And then in between all that, was my involvement with freestyle and Greco.
Yeah.
And that was the off-season wrestling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be, and I think part of this podcast, and we'll talk a little bit about what we imagine doing here, I think it will be wonderful to have you here meeting with other coaches and wrestlers, because I think some of those stories of the history of Maine wrestling and your role in them will come out. Obviously, there was also the period of refereeing, which is actually how we first met.
Yeah.
So you had a number of years of also being a referee.
Yeah, my coaching started in 70, and I became an official in 74.
Yeah.
And my last meet was the All-State tournament in 2016. That was my retirement event. And yeah, so 42 years of officiating and actually even longer of coaching.
Yeah. Well, I was a good friend of mine that I worked with for a long time. I asked him if he knew your name, and he said, no, I remember he wrestled a few of my matches, and he said that you were the most athletic referee. You're able to move around and get the best positions. So, maybe you don't have that quite that ability to move as agile now on the mat.
Well, it was funny when I first started coaching and officiating. The one thing that used to really burn me was a ref that didn't move well and wasn't in position. So I always promised myself if I ever got into it, I would be a ref that moved. So that thinking followed me through my officiating career.
So the one of the major things that I want to accomplish in this first podcast is talk a little bit about what we imagine for the show. And the reason I want to do that is to get this first podcast out to people and get their feedback, get their input. So this really becomes really a Maine amateur wrestling podcast, not just about you and I talking. Mm-hmm. But before we do that, I thought it would be interesting because this really always started with a conversation between the two of us. Is you agreed to this co-hosting this with me? Talk a little bit about what you imagine for this podcast overall, and why you've agreed to do it.
Well, primarily to try and get amateur wrestling here in Maine more exposure. Even through the season, you don't see much about wrestling in the papers. A lot of meets go totally unrecorded. We get a little bit of TV time once in a while, but not often. Certainly not like the other sports. So it's kind of the red-headed stepchild of high school sports, not only here in Maine, but in many other places too. But it's always been hard to get recognition for our athletes and our teams. And if we can do that through this effort, yeah, mission accomplished.
Well, I 100% agree. For people that haven't seen me on the mat, I'm new to Maine wrestling after retiring about a year ago. But 5 years of wrestling interrupted by some injuries when I was younger. But I always felt that call, and I think it's something that a lot of wrestlers really feel is a desire to not only give back, but to return to something that was very important for their own development. So being a referee, you see these amazing kids, you see these small towns and people coming out to watch these kids wrestle. And then you see the season-ending tournaments just filled with energy and passion. And then you see the TV and newspapers that are covering basketball, great sport, no problem with it, but no equal time for wrestling. And I 100% agree. There is a story here that needs to be told on a more wider basis associated with it. So that I agree with. For me, that's number one. The second thing for me, I'd be curious what your thoughts are, is seeing if we can't also be an aid in getting some sponsorships. So getting some money into the sport to help the experience of the wrestlers, resources for the coaches, and the best venue we can do for people and fans to come in and watch the sport.
I agree that, you just look back at this past season. After the state tournaments were completed, we still had our New England qualifier to go. And that event took place, and other than a little blurb in the paper, there wasn't any real mention about it at all, which was in itself was sad because those are all the best wrestlers from A and B on the same site wrestling off to go to the New Englands. And there was very little, if any, mention about it in any of the papers.
Yeah, and I mean, it was Belfast did a great job hosting the event, but we had 3 mats. 2 of them were down in the normal gym, and the one was upstairs, kind of in a crowded place. And I think Belfast did a great job of hosting it, but the place was packed, and you could imagine a bigger arena where all the mats are there. There's space that exists, and people can really see a better job of doing it. And the energy that was in there, the matches that we saw, it was so fun for me, for I guess it was the second time in the year where I was able just to watch it as a fan as opposed to as a referee. It was really quite an experience.
You know, there was a time when, back in the early 2000s, we were doing the state tournaments. Back then, there were 3 classes, A, B, and C, and we had been doing them at the Augusta Civic Center one year and then the Bangor Auditorium the next. And that was when we got our biggest crowds, because all 3 classes on 9 mats at the Augusta Civic Center, 8 up in Bangor. But we had all 3 classes going at the same time.
Yeah.
So all their respective fans were all there, and it was awesome. It was you know, kind of like that place had become the mecca of wrestling for one day in the state of Maine.
Yeah, and I think that the sport deserves it. I just think that there's these wrestlers, the coaches, the team atmosphere, and then I think all the things that go into it, which I think leads to kind of in my mind, the third part of the podcast, or why I wanted to do it. I know for me, my wrestling and overcoming my fears and anxieties, and then learning to prepare to overcome those really tough sessions where you're tired and you're working on a new move and you got other things on your mind, but committing to preparation and then getting on the mat and doing the best that you can in that match prepared me for every difficult thing I did in my life. And I think highlighting that for wrestlers that are thinking about entering the sport, or even parents that are thinking about, is wrestling a good decision for my kid? I see that as another aspect of it.
Absolutely. I mean, there are lessons that are learned through wrestling that you're probably not going to learn anyplace else, because it is a unique sport. But the biggest one being learning to deal with adversity and overcoming it. And not that you don't get that from other sports, but I think the physicality of wrestling really punches that point home. It really brings it right out to the person. You know, you got to work so hard, and you're not always guaranteed success just if you work hard. But at least the winning is the most important thing, but the effort is. Vince Lombardi.
Yeah.
But really, that's personified in wrestling, and you know, the oldest sport, the sport of the gods. And it's a very special sport in many ways, unique.
Oh, I 100% agree. And I think that's what's so exciting about doing this. And when we were up at Belfast, there was a little poster of Chris Pratt. And I think it said something like, before I acted, I wrestled. And there's a short clip I'd like to play of him talking about what wrestling had meant to him.
The thing I take away from wrestling is, or that I've carried with me from wrestling, is a sense of toughness and an idea that if I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to actually do it. And that's, you know, there were times when I wanted to quit. It wasn't always easy, and I think that struggle is what can make greatness. And you don't really know your worth unless you're forced to struggle. And wrestling was a real struggle.
Chris Pratt is one of my more favorite people out of Hollywood, and the fact that he wrestled has a lot to do with that. And what he just said in that little clip is right on the money.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I hadn't really known it until I saw that picture in Belfast, and he was in a very, very good wrestling team in a very good state of Washington, and it was incredibly successful. So it was impressive to see. And I know, again, for me, and I said this earlier, that, you know, I think that as you do harder and harder things in life, you're able to take on bigger and bigger challenges. But for what I was prepared for as a freshman in high school, that was the biggest step for me. Overcoming that fear and performing on the mat under what felt like incredible pressure. There was nothing I did in the rest of my life that was as big of a step.
That's so true. I mean, especially you go from, like, for instance, a middle school program to high school. That's a huge step as a freshman, because now you're at the bottom looking up at all those seniors and so forth. Then if you go on to the college level, it's an even bigger step.
Yeah.
And those guys that are ahead of you have had that much more experience. So to deal with that and overcome that adversity, that's huge. and it does help you for getting ready for life.
Yeah, and I think it would be interesting to, in this podcast, to not only cover, some of the middle school programs and what's happening in the high school level, but also follow some of those wrestlers that have gone on. And we know, I think, some of the wrestlers that we saw this year are going to go on and compete, and some of the ones from prior years I know are still competing. So, which then leads us, I think, really to the second thing that I wanted to cover in the premiere episode here, is to talk about what we imagine in doing in the show. I have some ideas. Maybe, Dennis, you want to share some of the things that you imagine first?
Well, hopefully through our efforts here, we gain some positive exposure for our sport, and that people will become more interested in the sport by seeing what it's really all about, and some of the people that are involved with it, athletes, coaches, and so forth, and maybe even referees as well. But
well, we've both been referees. I can tell you a little bit about my first year as the learning process of being a referee, but I think
it is a process.
Yeah, but I think there are so many amazing stories that I saw this year from coaches and wrestlers that I think I imagine that the off season here is an opportunity for us to kind of highlight some of those things in a period of time where the season isn't going on, and then prepare ourselves for the season to come. And so I think those coaches' stories, those wrestler stories, but also, again, in meeting you, which I really appreciate how you brought me and gave me a lot of feedback on my refereeing, but also introduced me to like the history of Maine wrestling as far as some of the people that are in your universe. And you start learning about the old rivalries, some of the rivalries that still exist today, some of the great stories that happened. And I think mixing those that history in together with the current thing will be great.
Yeah, I think the history being brought out is a very important part of what we're doing, because most people now who have youngsters wrestling now don't realize where this all started. And back in 1959 with Mr. Carmahalis down there at Sanford, and there were just basically a handful of schools. But matter of fact, that first year they didn't even really have a state championship. They just kind of got together and wrestled a few dual meets, and it grew from there.
Yeah.
And what it's grown into now is what you just saw this past season with the All-States and the girls having their own separate state tournament. I mean, that's incredible. And for me, those are highlights for this past year, where the girls having their first ever state meet, and crowning their own individual female state champions. That was a big thing.
Yeah, it was for me too, and I wanna give some space for that. And when we talk about our highlights for the season, for our experiences for the season, I think the one other thing that I imagine is, because I want to try to encourage people in Rumford to go out and see these incredible wrestlers that are at their high school, or Dixfield, or Skowhegan. And because, maybe people don't know what to do in the evening, go out and watch a dual meet and see what's going on. But it could be probably a little bit intimidating. You don't really know what's going on. So the Big Ten has this amazing program where once a week during the season, they have the top 6 matches. And obviously they're commentated. We have video out there, I think, and I think part of us is for us to ask the audience to send in, maybe a match that they think was a great match, and then maybe the two of us, or we bring in another coach to help commentate that match, to show people wrestling, understand the scoring, understand what's happening, and how it may even fit into an overall dual match. So I could see that as a component of what we're trying to do.
Absolutely. Part of the problem is most people just don't understand the sport of wrestling, because it is unique and different from other sports. I mean, most people grow up with football and basketball and baseball, but wrestling is a little bit different than that.
Yeah.
So to give them, that exposure to it, and maybe learn the rules behind the sport and so forth, I think would be an integral part of introducing them to the sport and hopefully gaining some interest and some fans.
So that's kind of why we're doing it, what we're imagining. Again, I really, to the degree that people make it through our podcast, We really would love to get some feedback on things that would be there. If there are coaches and wrestlers that want to appear on the show, I think we'll be also reaching out to people that we think would be good candidates for that. Let's do that. But I'd like to now, in our last segment here, move on to kind of our reflections of the year. And Dennis, maybe we could start with you. You talked a little bit about that, but maybe what were the key things that you saw this year that stood out to you?
Well, again, the real involvement of girls wrestling in the state and what it has come to this year, and then to have their own state championship meet that qualified them for the New Englands. And then for me, the highlight for the girls was to go down there and do what they did. I mean, 2 individual New England champions, the young lady from Noble, Hannah Perro, and of course Maddie Ripley from Oceanside, both winning their weight classes. And then 4 of the 8 top teams in the New Englands were from Maine, and Noble won it. It's simply amazing.
Yeah, I mean, given the size of Maine's population, where I think we're maybe 10% of the population or something like that, the idea that we could go in and have a championship for a team that's just a regular public school, not a magnet for wrestling or anything like that.
Yeah.
A wonderful program at Noble, but to win that championship, it really is amazing to me.
Well, yeah, because last year they only had Hannah Perro wrestling, and this year they had a few more girls come out, and they just all happened to be very talented and took the sport very quickly and went with it. But there's a number of programs, girls programs in the state. Mont Bleu comes to mind. They filled every weight class. They have 12 weight classes. They filled every weight.
Yeah.
And that kind of growth is important. And I think this is going to lead to next year. You're going to see an explosion of growth, not only in Maine, but I think all over New England. The fact that they had that first female New England championship run concurrently with the boys was big.
Yeah, and I think Maine could be proud of the leadership of the women and the coaches that taught them. I mean, refereeing these matches with the women, sometimes against other women, and times against men, was really incredible. And both seeing Hannah and Maddie compete, where I got to really see them compete, was both at the B South championship, where Maddie won that against men. And then Hannah, I got to see her compete in the B or at the A championship, where she ended up coming in 4th.
For Maddie to go on and win 2 state titles against the boys, that's a whole nother level of accomplishment.
Yeah, I remember. I remember one of the matches that I got to ref. The double leg tackle that she had, where her face just drove through the wrestler, really blasted that double leg tackle, was incredibly impressive.
Yeah, that was remarkable.
I think for me, I'll throw in one was the team championship in the Class A championship, which came down to Massabesic and Noble.
Yep.
And I think if I remember right, and you can correct me, Noble had a slight lead going into the championship round.
Yes, they did.
And every match that involved either wrestler from either of the team was, Noble screaming on one side of the gym and Massabesic on the other, and led up to the 165-pound match was the last match that either team was going to have, and the Massabesic wrestler pinned his opponent. And I remember again and I think I saw it in a newspaper article too, the Massabesic coach jumping up in the air when that pin happened.
Yeah, that was a special moment, I'm sure, for the Massabesic people. And they would have won that team tournament without Dominic pinning his opponent. But the coaches told him, "We need for you to pin." So he went out looking for the pin and got it, which added a little exclamation point and gave him a little more breathing room. But yeah, that was quite a match.
I think that, and I think that another misconception about wrestling is it's an individual sport. I think that anybody that has any interest in sports, if they were sitting in that gym watching the energy that led up to that pin and the roar of the crowd at that moment, it's undeniable how powerful the sport is.
Well, going to the NCAA Division I tournament, it made me think of like Iowa and Oklahoma State going back and forth, or Penn State, and the crowds. I mean, which would take up entire sections of the venue, and the crowds just going back and forth yelling for their, not only for their wrestlers, but cheers just back and forth. And that's what this was at that state meet, was Massabesic and Noble going back and forth, and it was fun to watch.
So we talked about Maddie and at Oceanside having an incredible year, both competing against the men and also winning the New England Championship against women. Both not to forget about her brother Gavin, who won the B State Championship and also the New England qualifier, and then was the highest placing man in Maine and came in third in the New Englands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he capped off a great career. I always enjoyed watching him wrestle. You want to talk about a technician? He was just like his sister. I mean, he knew his moves, and he executed them flawlessly.
I think that it will be really fun to watch both of them as they continue to compete and follow their careers as they continue doing wrestling going forward.
I did have a quick conversation with Gavin later in the season, and he mentioned that he's going to go to Maine Maritime Academy, which now it will be D3 level wrestling. So that is incredible for him and great for the program too.
Well, that will be fun to watch. I think another highlight for me, really not knowing you when I first met you and getting the feedback on my refereeing, was then all of a sudden you're being called up to announce Outstanding Wrestlers of the Year, and maybe talk about the couple of wrestlers that you were awarded there.
Well, the first one I did that at was at the Class A state tournament, and Gavin Tanner from Wyndham, the Wolfpack, won that award that day. And as he was walking towards me, we both started to smile, because last year at the All-State tournament, he won the Outstanding Wrestler at that event. So I was kidding with him, we're making a habit of this, and kind of laughed. And it's a special moment for both of us. And then a week later at the All-States, I presented that Outstanding Wrestler award, and that was to Lucas Libby from Mountain Valley at 150 pounds. And he had a great tournament. He really had an awesome day and very much deserved that.
Yeah, I agree, and I hope that as I reflect back as we're coming to the end of our podcast, I think we've done an okay job. I really look forward to. I think you've done wonderful. I look forward to getting community feedback. Let's try to use this as a way again to meet the goals that we talked about initially. Maybe we forgot a few wrestlers or teams or things in the past that we'd like to continue to highlight. Share that information with us so that we could continue to build a really great podcast. But with that, Dennis, I want to thank you for your time and your friendship coming back into wrestling and coming back into Maine wrestling. I appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to episode 1 of our podcast. And I want to have a special thank you to Amy Murphy of Amy Murphy Photography, who provided the incredible images that we used throughout the episode. And I also wanted to recognize the Recording Club at the Studio Portland for the production and creation of the podcast.